Every morning I woke up, nausea wrapped around my throat like a noose squeezing tighter with each breath. The doctors examined me, then examined me again. Blood work normal, heart normal, everything normal except my body was disappearing day by day. Then one day on a subway train, a stranger grabbed my wrist. "There's something wrong with what you're wearing." I looked down at the golden watch my son had given me. The man shook his head. "You need to take it off. Right now." In that moment, I had no idea that the truth was about to unravel everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. Hey everyone, what you're about to hear could save your life or someone you love. So please subscribe right now and hit that like button. Comment below with your thoughts and your own stories. Quick note, while some details have been altered for privacy and dramatized for impact, everything I'm sharing about recognizing danger and trusting your instincts is real. The message is real. Now let's begin. Every morning I woke up fighting the urge to vomit. It started just like that, no warning, no buildup. I'd open my eyes to the pale New York light filtering through my bedroom window, and instantly my stomach would twist into knots. For a split second, I'd lie there hoping it would pass. It never did. Within minutes, I'd be stumbling toward the bathroom like a drunk man, my body betraying me before my mind even caught up to what was happening. I'd grip the sink stare at my reflection in the mirror and wonder who the hell that pale, hollow-eyed man was looking back at me. I'm Michael Harrison. At 68 years old, I'd spent the last 4 decades building something real, a real estate empire that started small in the 90s and grew into something I was genuinely proud of. I owned a solid apartment building in Manhattan, managed rental properties across the 5 boroughs, and I'd done it all by showing up every single day, by being the kind of guy people could count on, by knowing when to negotiate and when to walk away. Success in business is about reading people, understanding what they want, before they even know it themselves. I'd always prided myself on that skill. I thought I could read a room, read a contract, read a person's intentions just by looking into their eyes. But that morning, nausea. That was something I couldn't read, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't control, no matter how hard I tried. I'd retired just 8 months earlier. Sarah had thrown me a small party, nothing fancy, just family and a few close friends. Jacob had given a toast that I remembered as genuine warm even. We'd talked about finally having time to travel to enjoy the life we'd built. I'd imagined golf on weekends, maybe taking a trip to Europe with the kids, finally reading all those books I'd bought and never opened. I'd imagined peace. Instead, I got this. My doctor, a competent man named Dr. Richardson, who'd been my primary physician for 15 years, ran a battery of tests. Blood work came back clean. Liver function, kidney function, cholesterol levels, glucose, thyroid, all normal, all textbook, perfect for a man my age. He checked my heart with a stethoscope, listened to my lungs, took my blood pressure 3 times, because the first reading seemed slightly elevated. Everything was within acceptable range. "Maybe it's stress," he suggested, leaning back in his leather chair with that well-rehearsed physician's smile, the one that says, "I've seen this before. Trust me, you're fine. You just retired. Your body's adjusting to the change. The mind can do funny things when it loses its routine." Stress. Right. I'd managed million-dollar deals without flinching. Negotiated with banks during the 2008 crisis when everyone around me was panicking, and now my body was supposed to fall apart. Because I finally had time to breathe, because I wasn't running from meeting to meeting anymore. I lived with my 2 kids, Jacob, my son, and Sarah, my daughter. Jacob was 35, self-employed, always seemed to have something going on in the business world, though I'll admit I didn't always understand the details. He'd moved back in about 6 months after I retired, claiming he needed to save on rent while he built up his portfolio. Sarah was 32, the family counselor by nature, the type of person who actually listened when you talked, who remembered details you'd mentioned weeks ago, who cared when you said you weren't feeling well. She worked in graphic design from home, which meant she was around most days. They'd both expressed concern about my condition in their own distinct ways. Jacob kept asking if I needed anything, kept checking in, sometimes popping his head into my room to see if I was okay, if I wanted him to pick up medicine or groceries. Sarah sat closer to me during dinner, watching my face like she was trying to diagnose me herself, like she could read the sickness in my eyes, if she just looked hard enough. There was something in her expression that I couldn't quite place, concern mixed with something else. Suspicion, maybe, but about what? But nothing changed. The mornings kept coming with their brutal regularity, and my stomach kept rebelling against me like it had its own agenda. I'd see other doctors, a gastroenterologist who ran scope procedures that found nothing, a neurologist who tested my reflexes and my cognitive function and declared me sharp as a tack, an endocrinologist who checked every hormone, every metabolic marker. I'd take medications that didn't work, try diets that made no difference, cut out caffeine and dairy and gluten just to see if something would stick. And every single time I'd leave a clinic with the same hollow feeling that nobody could explain what was happening to my body, that it existed in the spaces between what doctors could measure and what they couldn't. The weight started dropping off. I'd lost maybe 12 pounds in the first month, then another 8 pounds the next month. My clothes hung loose on me. My face looked different, gaunt, older somehow. I'd catch glimpses of myself in mirrors and barely recognize the man staring back. That's when the fear really set in. Not the fear of being sick I could handle, that could manage illness if I understood what it was. But this was different. This was the fear of the unknown, the terror of something happening to you that had no name, no explanation, no cure. It was the fear that something fundamental had broken inside me, something that existed in the darkness that modern medicine couldn't quite reach or illuminate. I'd spent my whole life in control. I made decisions, steered situations toward favorable outcomes, navigated uncertainty with confidence. But this was something happening to me, not something I was doing. I was a passenger in my own body, and the driver had no idea where we were going. I remember standing at my bathroom window one morning, staring at my reflection in the glass. I barely recognized myself. My skin had taken on a grayish, washed-out tone, the color of old newspaper. My eyes had lost that sharp edge, that gleam of certainty I'd always known. There were shadows under my eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. I looked like a man who was disappearing, slowly fading into something less than himself. Less than human, even. That's when I decided to take the subway that afternoon. I needed air. I needed to get out of the apartment, away from the concerned looks from Jacob and Sarah, away from my own spiraling thoughts, away from the bathroom where I'd spent so much of my time lately. I needed to feel like myself again, even if just for an hour. I needed to remember who I was before all of this started. I put on a light jacket, checked that I had my wallet and keys, old habits from my working days, and headed out into the Manhattan afternoon. The sun was bright, almost aggressive in its brightness. The streets were crowded with the usual mix of tourists and New Yorkers, all of them moving with purpose, all of them looking healthy and solid and real in a way I didn't feel anymore. I took the subway downtown. I wasn't going anywhere specific. I just wanted to ride, to watch the city pass by, to be among people without having to talk to them or explain myself to them. That was the thing about the subway in New York. You could be completely alone, even when you were surrounded by hundreds of other people. Everyone was in their own world, their own crisis, their own small drama. If I'd known then that my life was about to change forever, that a complete stranger on a crowded train would say something that would freeze my blood and set everything in motion, that this simple decision to get some air would become the hinge upon which my entire existence would turn, I might have stayed home. But sometimes the universe has its own plans. Sometimes it puts you exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there, even if you don't know it yet. Sometimes a stranger becomes your savior. But before I got on that subway, before I met the stranger who would change everything, there was a time when life felt perfect. Or at least it felt like it should be perfect. I'd spent months after my retirement trying to adjust to the rhythm of a man with nowhere to be. For nearly 5 decades, I'd woken up with purpose. There were deals to close properties, to inspect tenants, to manage contractors, to negotiate with. My life had a structure, a trajectory. Every day meant something. Every decision mattered. And then suddenly none of it did anymore. I was just another old guy with time on his hands and a bank account that made sure I'd never have to worry again. The adjustment should have been easier than it was. My son Jacob moved back into the apartment about 6 months after my retirement. He said he needed to get back on his feet, that New York real estate was brutal, and he was building something, but needed to conserve cash for a while. It made sense. Kids do that sometimes. They come back home when they need to regroup, when the world feels too sharp and demanding. I told him the spare room upstairs was his whenever he needed it. I meant it genuinely. I wanted to spend time with him, wanted to understand what he was building. Wanted to be the kind of father who supported his son's ambitions. Jacob was a handsome kid, tall, confident, with the kind of charm that made people comfortable around him. When he smiled, the whole room seemed to shift. He had that quality. Some people have the ability to make you feel like you're the only person in the world who matters. I'd always envied that about him, if I'm being honest. I'd built my success on competence and reliability, not on charisma. Jacob had both, and it made him dangerous in ways I didn't fully understand. Or maybe I just didn't want to understand. He'd ask about my health in those early months before things got really bad. "Dad, you look tired," he'd say over breakfast. "Maybe you should get more rest. Retirement should be about relaxing, right?" There was something in his tone that I couldn't quite place, concern mixed with something else, something that felt almost like curiosity. But about what I brushed it off. Fathers and sons have complicated relationships. We communicate through these small exchanges, these moments of checking in, that are never quite as simple as they seem on the surface. Sarah was different. My daughter had always been the one who actually listened, who seemed to care about the substance of things rather than the surface. She was a graphic designer, worked from home most days, which meant she was around more often. She'd sit with me in the mornings while I struggled through my coffee and my stomach's rebellion, and she'd just watch. Not in a clinical way like she was diagnosing me, but like she was trying to understand something. "Oh, Dad, when did this start?" she'd ask. The nausea, was it sudden or did it build up? I'd tell her it was sudden, that one day I woke up fine, and the next day I didn't. Which was true, except it wasn't the whole truth. There had been something else that came first, but I couldn't quite remember what. Not yet, anyway. Before the sickness, life had been genuinely good. I'd worked hard, my entire career, built something tangible, something real. I owned property. I had money in the bank. I had respect in my industry. People returned my calls, took my advice seriously. I'd raised 2 kids to adulthood, survived my marriage ending in divorce without destroying the relationship with my ex-wife, maintained friendships that mattered. By any reasonable measure, I'd done okay. I'd done more than okay. I had the kind of retirement that most people fantasized about. No debt, no immediate worries. The freedom to do whatever I wanted with my days. Travel was an option. Hobbies were an option. Taking my kids on vacation whenever I wanted, that was possible too. But there was something I'd missed, something I couldn't put my finger on. Some small detail that refused to settle into place, some piece of the puzzle that didn't fit quite right. It was like standing in a room where something is off, you can feel it, but you can't identify what it is. The picture is wrong in some subtle way that your eyes can't quite process. And then the sickness started, and I forgot all about that nagging sense of wrongness. I became consumed by it, by the mystery of my own failing body. I stopped paying attention to the small things, the way Jacob's eyes would flick toward my wrist every time he saw me, the way Sarah watched him when he wasn't looking, the way conversations would sometimes stop when I entered a room like I'd interrupted something important. Looking back now, I can see all the signs. I can see them clearly. The clues were right there in front of me the whole time. I just wasn't ready to see them yet. I was too comfortable, too trusting, too convinced that the people closest to me couldn't possibly hurt me. That's what fear does to you, I think. Fear teaches you not to trust. Fear teaches you to read the room, to notice when something is off, to remember that the world isn't always what it appears to be on the surface. And until fear forces its way into your life, until it makes you question everything you thought you knew, you remain blind to it. I remained blind for a very long time. It all started with a watch. 6 months before I found myself on that subway train, struggling to breathe through the nausea that had become my constant companion, there was Father's Day. June 15th, a Sunday. The kind of perfect New York day where the sun sits high and golden, and the city actually feels like it's smiling at you instead of grinding you under its heel. Jacob had called me that morning. "Dad, I have something special for you today. Something I've been planning for a while." I remember being surprised. Jacob wasn't usually the sentimental type. He was practical, efficient, focused on the next move. But that day, there was something different in his voice. Something that made me think maybe my son was changing, growing into a version of himself that understood the value of marking occasions, of acknowledging the bonds between people. We had dinner at the apartment, nothing fancy, just the three of us, Jacob, Sarah, and me. Jacob had actually cooked, which was rare. He'd made my favorite, a simple grilled steak with roasted vegetables the way I liked it. There was a bottle of wine open on the table, good wine, the kind you don't usually drink on a random Sunday. There were even flowers in a vase on the dining table, something Sarah must have insisted on. The whole scene felt carefully orchestrated, like Jacob had choreographed every element of the evening with precision. After dinner, after we'd cleared the plates and settled back into our chairs with our wine glasses, Jacob looked directly at me with an intensity that made something in my chest tighten slightly. He said, "I want to give you something. Something that belonged to your father and before that belonged to his father." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. It was the kind of box that usually contained jewelry, dark green velvet, worn soft from age with gold filigree embossed on the corners. He opened it. Inside, nestled on white silk padding, was a watch. Not just any watch, my grandfather's watch. My father's watch. A beautiful gold timepiece with an elegant face, Roman numerals marking the hours, a thin second hand that swept around with mechanical precision. It was an Omega vintage, probably from the 1960s, the kind of piece that had real weight and substance to it. The kind of thing that meant something. I felt my throat tighten. I'm not an emotional man by nature. I don't cry at movies or get choked up easily. But this holding my grandfather's watch again after so many years, it stirred something in me. Something about legacy, about the passing down of important things from one generation to the next. "Jesus, Jacob," I said quietly. "Where did you find this?" "I've had it for a while," he said. I wanted to make sure it was properly restored, that it was working perfectly before I gave it to you. "Dad, this watch has been in our family for 3 generations. I want it to pass to you now so you can wear it. So you can have that piece of history with you every single day." Sarah was watching this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was joy there, definitely happiness for both of us. But underneath it, there was something else. A kind of wariness, maybe. A tightness around her eyes that suggested she was monitoring something, paying attention to something specific. But I was too caught up in the moment to really examine what that might be. Jacob lifted the watch from its box with reverence. "Dad, I need you to do something for me. I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" I asked, already reaching for the watch. "I need you to promise me that you'll wear this every single day, that you won't take it off. Not for showers, not for anything. I want this watch to be part of you, a permanent symbol of our connection, of the love between us. Our family's legacy always with you." It was an unusual request. Most watches you'd take them off to shower, to sleep, to be safe. But there was something almost poetic about what he was saying, something that made it feel important. Made it feel like more than just a request about a timepiece. "I promise," I said, and I meant it completely. I was touched by the gesture, by the weight of what he was giving me, by the weight of what he was asking me to do. Jacob smiled then. It was a real smile, at least it looked real. He reached over and fastened the watch around my wrist himself, his fingers working the clasp with practiced ease. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. When he pulled his hand away, the watch sat perfectly on my wrist, the weight of it immediately feeling right. Familiar somehow, even though it had been years since I'd worn it. "Perfect," Jacob said softly. "It looks like it was made for you." Sarah reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "It's beautiful, Dad. Grandpa would be happy to see you wearing it." The evening continued. We talked about my retirement plans, about Jacob's business ventures, which still remained somewhat vague to me, about Sarah's design projects. We drank more wine. The city lights twinkled outside the windows of my apartment, and for the first time in months since I'd officially retired, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what I'd worked for all those years. This moment. This family. This connection. I looked down at the watch several times that evening, checked the time, felt the weight of it on my wrist. It felt right. It felt like it belonged there, like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. I had no idea, sitting there in my dining room with my children, that I was wearing the instrument of my own slow, deliberate destruction. I had no idea that the beautiful, meaningful gift I'd just received was a trap carefully crafted, perfectly disguised. I had no idea that this watch, this precious piece of family history, was about to become a weapon. The first few days after Father's Day, I felt like a man who'd been given a second chance at something. I'm not sure what exactly. Maybe it was a chance to feel closer to my past, to carry a piece of my father and grandfather with me in a tangible way. Or maybe it was just the simple joy of feeling genuinely appreciated by my son in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I wore the watch everywhere. To the grocery store, to the gym, to bed even, which was unusual for me since I'd normally take off anything valuable before sleep. But I'd made a promise to Jacob, and I meant it. The watch became part of my morning ritual, one of the first things I'd acknowledge when I woke up. I'd flex my wrist, feel the weight of it, and smile. Jacob seemed to notice. He seemed to notice very much. In those first days, he'd find reasons to be near me. We'd sit in the kitchen together, and he'd casually ask about my day, about what I'd been up to, about how retirement was treating me. But his eyes would drift again and again to my wrist. Not in an obvious way. Nothing that would have alarmed me if I'd been paying closer attention. But there was a pattern to it, a moment when his gaze would flick downward, check the watch, verify that it was still there, still on my arm, still doing whatever it was supposed to be doing. "How's the watch?" he'd ask, seemingly casual. "Still keeping good time." "Pshiktiam," I'd tell him. "It's incredible, actually. I can't believe you found it. I can't believe you had it restored." "Good," he'd say, and there would be this expression on his face. I remember it now, though. At the time, I couldn't have named it. Something that looked like satisfaction mixed with something darker. Something that looked almost like hunger, but I don't think that's quite the right word. It was more like anticipation. Like he was waiting for something, and the watch was somehow connected to that waiting. Sarah, meanwhile, was doing her own watching. She'd catch Jacob checking my wrist, and something in her face would tighten. She'd look away quickly, but not before I caught that flicker of concern. Or was it suspicion? It was hard to tell. "You like the watch?" she asked me one morning while Jacob was out of the apartment. "I love it," I said honestly. "It's one of the nicest gifts I've ever received." "Why?" She hesitated for a moment, like she was considering whether to say something. Then she seemed to decide against it. "Just, I'm glad you're happy, Dad." There was something in her tone that made me uneasy even then. But I pushed it aside. Kids have their own things going on. Sarah probably had a design project stressing her out, or maybe she was worried about something work-related. It wasn't necessarily about me or the watch. Life settled into a new rhythm. I wore the watch. Jacob would check on it periodically, always with the same casual air, always with his eyes drifting downward for that brief moment of verification. Sarah would watch Jacob watching the watch, and she'd bite her lip and say nothing. And I felt connected. To my family, to my past, to something larger than myself. This was what I'd imagined retirement would be like, a time when the relationships mattered more than the work, when I could simply exist in the presence of people I loved and feel grateful for their company. I remember one evening particularly clearly. We were all in the living room, Jacob, Sarah, and me. Jacob was on his phone scrolling through something, but he'd look up at me every few minutes. Sarah was reading a design book, but I could tell from the tension in her shoulders that she wasn't actually absorbing the content. She was paying attention to Jacob, to us, to something that I still couldn't quite perceive. "But you know what?" Jacob said, suddenly looking up from his phone. "I'm really glad you like the watch, Dad. It means a lot to me." "Of course I like it," I said. "It's perfect. It's been in our family for generations. I'll pass it on to you or Sarah eventually when the time comes." Jacob's expression shifted for just a moment, a flicker of something I couldn't quite identify. Then he smiled, and it was like a cloud passing in front of the sun. "Yeah," he said. "Eventually." But there was something in the way he said it that made my skin prickle. Something that felt like a threat or a promise or something in between that I didn't have a name for. That night, I lay in bed with the watch still on my wrist, and I found myself wondering for the first time whether something was genuinely wrong or whether I was just being paranoid. Retirement had made me anxious in ways I wasn't used to. Without work to focus on, my mind was starting to imagine problems where there might not be any. Or maybe there were problems, and I just wasn't ready to see them yet. Maybe I was more blind than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I woke up feeling slightly nauseous. I told myself it was something I'd eaten the night before. I told myself it would pass. I got out of bed, showered, dressed, and tried to ignore the way my stomach seemed to be working against me, the way my body seemed to be sending me a signal that I wasn't quite ready to receive. I went downstairs, made myself coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. Jacob was already there eating breakfast, and when he saw me, his eyes immediately went to my wrist. He checked the watch, saw that it was still there, and then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that makes you uncomfortable, even if you can't explain why. 1 week after that Father's Day dinner, I woke up in the pre-dawn darkness with a strange sensation in my stomach. It wasn't pain exactly. It was more like pressure. Like something inside me had shifted slightly out of alignment, and my body was sending a distress signal that I didn't yet know how to interpret. I lay there for a moment, very still, trying to understand what was happening. The watch on my wrist ticked steadily, keeping perfect time, keeping watch over me in the darkness of my bedroom. Then the sensation intensified. I stumbled out of bed and made my way to the bathroom, moving quickly but carefully, like I was navigating through water. I gripped the sink and waited. My stomach twisted, my throat tightened, and then mercifully the feeling began to subside. It didn't disappear completely. There was a lingering queasiness, an uncomfortable awareness of my own body that I usually don't have to think about. But the acute discomfort eased. I brushed my teeth, splashed water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked fine. Tired maybe, but that was normal for a man my age. Nothing suggested that something was fundamentally wrong with me. I went downstairs and made coffee. The smell of it was comforting, familiar, one of the small rituals I'd allowed myself to keep from my working life. I sat at the kitchen table and waited for the nausea to fully pass. It did eventually, leaving behind only a faint memory of discomfort, like a bad dream you mostly forget as soon as you're awake. By the time Jacob came downstairs, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Bad seafood from the restaurant we'd ordered from the night before, probably. Or maybe my stomach was just adjusting to retirement, to the different rhythm of my days. Stress manifests in strange ways in the body. I knew that from my years managing business deals and navigating difficult negotiations. The mind and body are more connected than most people realize. "Morning, Dad," Jacob said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. His eyes were sharp, alert, not the eyes of someone who'd just woken up, but the eyes of someone who'd been waiting for something. He glanced at me, then at my wrist, at the watch, at the golden circle that never left my arm. I didn't notice the significance of that glance at the time. "Morning," I replied. "Sleep well?" "Really well," he said. He was watching me carefully, paying attention to my face, my demeanor, my body language. "How are you feeling?" "You look a little off." "I'm fine," I said, and it was true, or at least it was true in the moment. "Just a weird stomach thing this morning. I think the food last night didn't agree with me." Jacob nodded slowly, like he was absorbing this information, filing it away, comparing it to some data he'd already collected. "That happens," he said. "Your body gets more sensitive as you get older. Has to be more careful about what you put in it." There was something in the way he said it that felt odd to me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. It was like listening to someone speak a language you almost understand. You catch the individual words, but the deeper meaning remains slightly out of reach. Sarah appeared a few minutes later, already dressed for the day, and she looked between Jacob and me with an expression that suggested she'd picked up on something I'd missed. Her eyes lingered on my wrist for just a moment before she looked away. "Dad, you okay?" she asked. "You look pale." "I'm fine," I said again. "Just a little stomach trouble this morning." Sarah exchanged a glance with Jacob that I found somewhat strange, though I couldn't have explained why. It was like they were communicating in a language that only they understood, sharing a moment of understanding that I wasn't part of. The nausea didn't return for a few days. By the end of the week, I'd almost forgotten about that morning entirely. Life had settled back into its comfortable rhythm: coffee in the morning, a walk around the neighborhood, lunch, a bit of television, in the afternoon dinner with my kids. Retirement was starting to feel like what I'd imagined it would be. Then it happened again. This time it was worse. The nausea hit me harder, lasted longer. I was in the bathroom for nearly 45 minutes, my body convincing me that something serious was wrong, that I needed to get medical attention immediately. By the time it passed, I was shaking, my shirt damp with sweat, my head throbbing with a low-level pain that seemed to radiate from behind my eyes. I called my doctor's office and made an appointment for later that week. The receptionist seemed unfazed by my symptoms. "Sounds like gastroenteritis," she said breezily. "Should resolve itself in a few days. But come in if it gets worse." It was only after I'd hung up that I allowed myself to feel genuinely worried. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just bad seafood or retirement stress. Something in my body was genuinely malfunctioning, and I had no idea what it was. I stood in my bedroom, looking at myself in the mirror, and for the first time since I'd put on the watch, I felt something shift in my chest. A small tightening. A warning that something I wasn't ready to acknowledge was beginning to take root inside me. I looked down at my wrist, at the beautiful golden watch that Jacob had given me. The watch that I'd promised to wear forever. The watch that I couldn't take off even if I wanted to. The watch that was somehow impossibly connected to this growing wrongness in my body. But I didn't know that yet. I couldn't have known it. I just knew that something was changing. Something was beginning, and I had no idea how to stop it. Dr. Richardson's office was on the Upper East Side, a 15-minute cab ride from my apartment. I'd been going to him for 15 years, ever since I'd moved to New York full-time and needed someone to manage my health. He was competent, thorough, the kind of doctor who actually listened when you talked to him, instead of just running through a checklist of symptoms. That morning, sitting in his waiting room, surrounded by magazines I had no interest in reading, I felt like I was overreacting. The nausea had mostly subsided. I'd had a decent breakfast. Maybe this whole thing was just my body adjusting to a new rhythm, like Dr. Richardson would probably say. Maybe I was being a hypochondriac, making something out of nothing. But then I remembered waking up on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m, my body heaving, my mind spinning with the certainty that something was genuinely wrong with me. And I was glad I'd made the appointment. The nurse called my name and I followed her back to the examination room. She took my weight. I'd lost a few pounds since my last visit 6 months ago, and my blood pressure. Everything seemed fine, normal, unremarkable. Dr. Richardson came in, shook my hand, and asked me to describe my symptoms. I walked him through the timeline, the nausea that started about a week ago, the fact that it seemed to happen mostly in the mornings, the way it would peak and then subside over the course of half an hour or so. He listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and then said the words that would become increasingly familiar to me over the next few months. Let's run some tests and see what we're dealing with. The phlebotomist came and took blood samples, 3 vials drawn with practiced efficiency. I watched the blood flow into the containers and tried not to think about all the ways a body could go wrong, all the diseases and conditions that could be lurking in your system without you knowing it. The nurse gave me a cup for a urine sample. "Bathroom's down the hall," she said cheerfully, like I was collecting a souvenir instead of proving my body's chemical composition to a medical professional. Then came the cardiac workup. Dr. Richardson listened to my heart, with a stethoscope asked me to take deep breaths, watched my chest rise and fall. He took my blood pressure again 3 times, actually, which made me slightly nervous, though he assured me everything looked good. He checked my reflexes with a small rubber hammer, had me follow his finger with my eyes as he moved it in various directions. "How's your energy level?" he asked. "Not great," I admitted. "I've been more tired than usual." He nodded, made a note on his chart. "That could be related to the nausea. Dehydration, malnutrition, even mild cases can make you feel run down. The whole examination probably took 20 minutes, but it felt longer. It felt like being dissected, like my body was being read like a book, and the doctor was trying to decipher the text to figure out what was wrong with me. When he finally stepped back and said, "I think we've got everything we need," I felt a wave of relief wash over me. At least now we'd have some answers. "When will the results come back?" I asked. "She'll give us 3 to 5 business days," he said. "We'll call you as soon as we have anything to report." 3 to 5 days. A window of time where I didn't have to think about this, where I could pretend everything was fine. I left the office and took a cab back home, feeling oddly lighter than I had in days. At least I was doing something. At least I'd taken action. The results came back 4 days later. Dr. Richardson's nurse called in the late afternoon, said everything looked normal. Blood work was clean. Urine was clean. Heart was functioning perfectly. Blood pressure was slightly elevated, but nothing concerning for a man my age. Dr. Richardson would like to see you, though, the nurse said, just to do a quick follow-up and discuss what might be causing the symptoms. I went back to the office the following Monday. Dr. Richardson was his usual professional self, but I could see a faint line of confusion between his eyebrows as he reviewed my chart. Everything looks fine, Michael, he said. And I mean that genuinely fine. Your blood work is excellent. Your cardiac function is excellent. You don't have diabetes, you don't have thyroid issues, you don't have any of the common culprits that cause nausea in men your age. So what is it? I asked. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together thoughtfully. That's the tricky part. Without a clear, organic cause, we're probably looking at something stress-related. Have you had any major life changes recently? Well, I retired about 8 months ago, I said. There you go, he said, nodding like this explained everything. That's a significant transition, Michael. More significant than most people realize. You've structured your entire adult life around work, around having a purpose and a routine. Suddenly, all of that changes. Your body reacts to that kind of disruption. Stress manifests in unexpected ways. He prescribed me an antacid to take as needed, recommended that I try relaxation techniques, meditation, yoga, that sort of thing, and told me to come back if the symptoms got worse. I left his office feeling oddly unsatisfied. Not exactly relieved, but not exactly worried either. There was something unsettling about having every test come back normal when you know that something is genuinely wrong with you. It was like being gaslit by your own body. Like your suffering had been deemed officially acceptable because the medical establishment couldn't identify a cause for it. On the cab ride home, I found myself looking down at my wrist, at the watch, at the golden circle that had never left my arm since Jacob placed it there. I thought about Jacob's insistence that I wear it always. I thought about the way he'd check to make sure it was still there. I thought about Sarah's strange expression when she'd seen me the day after my symptoms started, and then I pushed those thoughts away. I was being paranoid. There was no connection. The watch was just a watch. Jacob was just being a concerned son. Sarah was just being a concerned daughter. Everything was fine. The doctors said so. But deep in my chest, in a place I couldn't quite articulate, I knew that everything wasn't fine. I knew that something was beginning, something that medicine couldn't quite see yet. Something that was growing slowly, quietly, like a shadow spreading across a wall. Something that was only going to get worse. 3 months in, I barely recognized myself in the mirror anymore. The nausea had become relentless. Every morning, without fail, I'd wake up and sprint to the bathroom. It wasn't just a few minutes of discomfort anymore, it was violent, all-consuming. I'd stand there gripping the sink, wondering if this was what the rest of my life was going to look like. 30 minutes, 45 minutes sometimes. And when it finally stopped, I'd be left feeling hollowed out, drained of everything. But the nausea was just the beginning. By week 2 of that 3rd month, I started losing weight. And not in a healthy, planned way. I'd lost maybe 15 pounds without even trying. My clothes hung on me like they belonged to someone else. I'd catch Sarah watching me with this expression I couldn't quite read, concern mixed with something darker, something that looked almost like fear. She never said anything directly, but I could see it in her eyes every time I walked into a room. "Dad, you're not eating enough," she'd say, her voice tight. "I am," I'd tell her. "I'm just not hungry." That was the strange part. It wasn't that I was deliberately starving myself. Food just didn't appeal to me anymore. I'd sit down with a plate, and after a few bites, my stomach would twist in protest. I'd push the plate away, and Sarah would exchange these looks with Jacob that made me feel like I was missing something important. Then came the hair. I noticed it first in the shower. At first it was just a few strands, nothing unusual. But within days, entire clumps came out in my hands. I'd run my fingers through my hair and watch as thick tufts fell into the sink. I started keeping the bathroom door locked because I didn't want Sarah to see. Didn't want her to worry any more than she already was. But of course she noticed. One morning she caught sight of my pillow covered in gray strands and her face went pale. "Dad, this isn't normal," she said quietly. She was right. Nothing about this was normal. My skin had taken on this grayish quality, like all the color had been drained out of me. Dark circles had settled under my eyes, permanent fixtures now. And then these rashes started appearing, strange red patches on my arms and neck that came and went without warning. My fingernails looked brittle and discolored, splitting at the edges. Even my gums had started to bleed when I brushed my teeth. The headaches were relentless. They'd start sometime in the afternoon and linger into the evening, a dull throb that no amount of aspirin could touch. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was happening to my body. This wasn't just stress. This wasn't retirement adjustment. This was something else entirely. 4 different doctors. That's how many I saw over the course of those 3 months. Dr. Patterson ran every test he could think of. Blood work, urinalysis, EKG, chest X-ray. Everything came back normal. "Your heart's strong, Michael. Your lungs are clear. Your blood pressure is elevated, but nothing we can't manage." Dr. Patterson suggested it might be thyroid-related. More tests. All normal. Dr. Rashid wondered if it could be some kind of autoimmune issue. More blood work. Nothing. The last doctor, a gastroenterologist named Dr. Foster, sat across from me with this look of genuine confusion. "I don't have an explanation for what you're describing, Mr. Harrison. Your system looks remarkably healthy on paper. Whatever this is, it's not showing up in any of the standard tests." I felt like I was going insane. I wasn't imagining these symptoms. I could feel them, every single one, all the time. My body was screaming that something was wrong, desperately wrong, but modern medicine couldn't find a single thing to confirm it. I started to wonder if maybe the doctors were right, if maybe it really was all in my head. But Sarah knew better. One evening in the kitchen, I caught her studying me with that worried expression. I tried to smile to reassure her that her old man was going to be fine. But the smile probably looked more like a grimace, the face of a man who's barely holding it together. "Dad," she said, stepping closer. "Something's really wrong. We need to figure out what it is." I wanted to argue with her, to tell her I had it under control. But the truth was I didn't. I felt like I was fading away day by day, and nobody could explain why. The watch was still on my wrist. Jacob had made sure I understood how important it was that I never take it off. Every time I thought about removing it, I'd remember his face, that expression of love and concern, and I'd leave it right where it was. I had no idea that the real nightmare was only just beginning. It was Sarah who finally forced me to confront what was happening. She caught me one afternoon, sitting in the living room, staring at nothing. I'd lost track of time, couldn't tell if it had been 5 minutes or 50. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, and I didn't even have the energy to pretend I was okay anymore. "Dad," she said, sitting down next to me on the couch. Her voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath it. "We need to talk." I knew what was coming. I'd been waiting for it. "You're not okay." She continued, not bothering with pleasantries. Sarah had always been direct. That was her mother's influence, I suppose. "And I'm scared. I'm really scared for you." "I know you are," I told her. "But I'm handling it." "Are you?" She turned to face me fully. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're disappearing. Your hair's falling out. You've lost so much weight. You can barely keep food down. And you're telling me the doctors can't find anything wrong." "That's exactly what I'm telling you." She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Dad, have you considered that maybe this isn't physical? Maybe your body's responding to something emotional?" There it was, the question I'd been dreading. "Sarah." "I'm not depressed," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how defensive I sounded. I'm not having a mental breakdown. My body is sick. Something is genuinely wrong with me and nobody can figure out what it is. I'm not saying you're making it up, she said gently. I'm saying that grief, stress, trauma, these things can manifest physically. You just retired. You've lost structure. Maybe, it's not that. I cut her off maybe more sharply than I intended. I promise you, sweetheart, it's not psychological. This is real. She studied me for a long moment, and I could see the worry etched into every line of her face. Okay, she finally said. Then we need to do something different. New doctors, specialists. We need to figure this out because whatever's happening to you is getting worse, not better. She was absolutely right about that. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into research with the kind of intensity I'd only seen her bring to her most important projects. She found specialists, a hematologist, a neurologist, an infectious disease expert. She made appointment after appointment, drove me to each consultation, sat in the waiting rooms with her arms crossed, her jaw set with determination. I loved her for it, but I could also see the frustration building behind her eyes. Each specialist ran their own comprehensive tests. Each one came back normal. It was becoming absurd, almost comical in its frustration. I don't understand, Sarah said one evening, her voice cracking slightly. We were in the kitchen, and she was making tea chamomile, the kind she thought would help me sleep. How is this possible? You're clearly very sick. How is everything coming back normal? I didn't have an answer for her. Honestly, I was beginning to wonder if I was losing my mind. The thing that struck me most was how different Jacob's response was compared to Sarah's. While she was hovering, making phone calls, researching rare medical conditions at midnight, Jacob would just exist. He'd come home from wherever he spent his days, ask if I was feeling better, and when I'd say no, he'd nod and disappear into his room. There was no urgency in him, no real concern, just a kind of neutral acceptance like this was all perfectly normal and expected. I remember one particular evening sitting at the dinner table with both of them. Sarah was describing some new theory she'd read about something involving rare mineral deficiencies. Jacob was picking at his food, barely listening. When he finally looked up, he glanced at my wrist at the watch and then met my eyes. He smiled. Not a warm smile, not concerned, just checking, observing, making sure the watch was still there. That's when something shifted inside me. Nothing I could articulate, nothing I could prove in a court of law. Just a feeling deep in my gut that something was fundamentally wrong. Not with my body, with something else entirely. Something connected to him, but I didn't say anything. How could I? What would I even say? My son looks at me in a certain way, so he must be guilty of something. It didn't make logical sense, yet I couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at me. I looked at Sarah across the table, genuinely worried, genuinely trying to help, and I looked at Jacob with his neutral expression and his checking eyes, and I felt profoundly alone. Like I was the only person in the room who could see that something wasn't adding up. I'm going to figure this out, I told Sarah quietly. I don't know how yet, but I'm not going to give up. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand firmly. I know you won't, Dad, and I'm here with you. We'll figure it out together. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that together the two of us could uncover what was destroying me from the inside out. But I was beginning to suspect that the answer wasn't going to come from a laboratory or a doctor's office. It was already sitting across from me, smiling, that empty smile, wearing my trust like a weapon. But I didn't know that Jacob had prepared something else, something far worse than what was already happening. 4 months into wearing that watch, my deterioration accelerated in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't gradual anymore. It was violent. It was like someone had hit fast forward on my decline and my body was struggling to keep up with the destruction. The first time I noticed something had changed, it was a Tuesday morning. Jacob had set out my coffee on the kitchen counter like he always did. He'd taken to doing that over the past few weeks, being helpful, attentive, almost eager to assist. I appreciated it at the time. I was too weak to make coffee myself most days anyway. I drank it the way I always did. Black, no sugar. Still warm from the pot. Within an hour, my stomach started twisting violently. At first, it was just uncomfortable, a cramping sensation that reminded me of food poisoning. I thought maybe I'd eaten something bad the night before, but then it got progressively worse. Much worse. The nausea that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in those first 3 months. It wasn't the gentle queasiness that had become my constant companion. This was aggressive, punishing, relentless. I barely made it to the bathroom before my body rejected everything I had inside it. I was bent over the toilet, retching uncontrollably, and I remember thinking that surely this was it. Surely this was the moment when my body would finally give up completely. But it wasn't the end. It was just the terrifying beginning of a new nightmare. For the next 3 days, my digestive system seemed to turn against me with deliberate cruelty. Every time I tried to consume something, soup, crackers, plain toast, my body would reject it violently within minutes. And it wasn't just simple rejection. It was violent expulsion accompanied by sharp stabbing cramping in my abdomen that made me cry out in pain. I was losing fluids faster than I could possibly replace them. My lips started cracking and bleeding. My mouth felt like sandpaper. I'd lie in bed drenched in sweat, and I couldn't tell anymore if it was from fever or from pure, unadulterated terror. I was genuinely afraid I was dying. "Dad, we need to get you to the hospital." Sarah set her face completely pale as she watched me from the doorway of my bedroom. I could see the raw fear in her eyes, and that fear infected me even more deeply. "Not yet," I managed to say through gritted teeth. "Just give it another day, please." But I didn't believe my own words. I genuinely, in my core, believed I was approaching the end of my life. I'd made it through 3 months of mysterious illness. I'd survived significant weight loss and dramatic hair loss and strange rashes that came and went without any logical explanation. But this felt fundamentally different. This felt final. This felt like the moment when my body would simply shut down system by system, organ by organ, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. Jacob came by my room that afternoon. I remember the way he looked at me, really looked at me lying there in bed, hollow-eyed and trembling uncontrollably. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood in the doorway, silently observing. Then he asked if I needed anything at all. "Water." I croaked my voice, barely recognizable as my own. "And maybe some ginger ale if we have it." He brought both to me without hesitation. I drank the ginger ale in small, careful sips, trying desperately to be gentle with my stomach, trying to let it adjust gradually. 20 minutes later, I was back in the bathroom retching again. By day 4, I was genuinely considering calling 911. I was absolutely convinced I had some kind of severe bacterial infection, E. coli salmonella, something deadly that had infiltrated my system and was systematically destroying me from the inside out. But every time I picked up my phone, something stopped me. Pride, perhaps. Or just overwhelming exhaustion. I didn't have the energy to endure another hospital visit, another round of comprehensive tests that would inevitably come back completely normal. So I suffered. I suffered in my bed. I suffered in my bathroom at all hours. I suffered in the dark hours of the night when Sarah was asleep, and nobody could possibly see how deteriorated my condition had become. What I didn't know, what I absolutely couldn't have known, was that this wasn't a natural infection at all. This wasn't an illness progressing according to its own biological timeline. This was deliberate. This was calculated. this was intentional. Someone was actively doing this to me. And that someone was living under my roof, sleeping in a bedroom down the hall, eating meals at my table. I couldn't understand it then. I was far too sick and far too confused to comprehend what was actually happening to my body. But looking back now, I can see the pattern with stunning clarity. Jacob had been patient with the watch, initially letting the poison accumulate slowly, subtly building up inside my system over many months. But then something must have changed his mind about the timeline. Maybe he thought I was deteriorating too slowly. Maybe he was growing impatient. Maybe he wanted to accelerate the process dramatically, so he'd introduced a new element into the equation. Something faster, something more aggressive, something designed to overwhelm my system quickly. By the end of that brutal week, I'd lost another 8 pounds. I could feel my ribs protruding through my shirt clearly. My hands looked skeletal, all skin stretched tight over bone and prominent blue veins. I was a shadow of the man I'd been just a few months before. I was a dying man, and everyone around me knew it. Sarah was insisting I go to the emergency room. She was threatening to call an ambulance if I didn't cooperate. Jacob remained patient, calm, consistently asking if there was anything he could do to help ease my suffering. And I was sitting in the middle of it all, far too sick and far too confused to understand what was actually occurring. Too trusting to suspect that the poison wasn't originating from my body's own internal betrayal. Too innocent to realize the truth. It was coming deliberately from someone I genuinely loved deeply. Someone I was supposed to trust implicitly with my life. That's when Sarah discovered everything. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. She'd gone into Jacob's room looking for something he'd borrowed from her, a charger, I think, or maybe a book. She didn't go in there often. Jacob had always been private, territorial about his space. But this time she needed something, and she didn't think twice about searching for it. That's when she saw it. Half hidden under a pile of dirty clothes on his desk, a small cardboard box with a skull and crossbones printed prominently on the side. The kind of box you don't mistake for anything else. The kind of box that makes your blood run cold the absolute moment you see it. Sarah told me later that her hands had been visibly shaking as she picked it up carefully. The box was nearly empty. Most of its contents had already been used for what she couldn't initially imagine. Or maybe she could imagine it all too well, and that realization was even worse than not knowing. She stood there in that room holding that box, and suddenly everything made perfect sense. Every single piece of the puzzle that had been scattered across months of confusion suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The watch. The way Jacob always checked to make sure I was still wearing it. The sudden dramatic escalation of my symptoms. The way he'd been making my coffee every single morning. The strange, cold way he'd looked at me when I was at my absolute worst, lying in bed, barely conscious, barely alive. My own son. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Sarah found me in my room that evening. I was sleeping, or trying to. The pain had gotten so unbearable that sleep was almost impossible to achieve. But I must have drifted off at some point because I woke to find her sitting carefully on the edge of my bed, her face completely ashen, her eyes red from crying. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to talk. Right now." I could hear the raw fear in her voice. I could see it etched into every line of her body. Something had happened. Something terrible had been discovered. She told me what she'd found, speaking slowly and carefully. I remember not fully understanding at first. My mind was too foggy, too completely broken down by illness to process what she was telling me. But she said it again, word by word, making absolutely sure I understood every single thing. Jacob had been poisoning me. The watch, the coffee, both of them. He'd been systematically, deliberately, and methodically destroying my health from the inside out for months now. I should have felt shock. I should have felt complete betrayal. But mostly I felt something else entirely: confirmation. Because some part of me had already known this truth. Some deep instinctive part of my consciousness had sensed that the danger wasn't coming from outside my home. It was coming from inside. From within my own family. From someone I'd raised with my own hands. Someone I'd trusted completely and unconditionally. "We have to call the police," Sarah said immediately, her voice shaking with fear. "We have to tell them everything right now." But even as she said those words, I could see her hesitation clearly written across her face. I could see the internal war happening inside her. This was still her brother, no matter what he'd done. This was still family. And as much as she knew what he'd done, as much as she understood the horrifying truth, part of her was still struggling desperately with that impossible reality. "And if we call the police," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper, "he's going to know we know. And if he knows that we know, then what?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "He finishes what he started, Dad. He's already tried to kill you. He's already been actively poisoning you for months." She was absolutely right. Of course she was right. But we were both thinking the same terrifying thing simultaneously. What would Jacob do if he realized his carefully constructed plan had been discovered? What would a desperate man do when his entire scheme was about to unravel completely? Sarah left my room, and I heard her pacing in the hallway outside. Back and forth, her footsteps a constant rhythm of anxiety. I could imagine the thoughts spinning chaotically through her mind. The fear, the guilt, the impossible choice she was being forced to make. When she came back into my room, her expression had hardened considerably. The fear was still there beneath the surface, but so was resolve. So was determination. "I'm going to watch him," she said, her voice steady now. "I'm going to document everything he does, and then we're going to the police with evidence they can't possibly ignore." "Sarah, that's dangerous. That's really dangerous. It's more dangerous than letting him keep poisoning you." She shook her head firmly. "No, I'm doing this. We're doing this together, and we're going to make absolutely sure he never has the chance to hurt you again." She kissed my forehead gently, and I could feel her trembling beneath her newfound courage. My little girl was terrified, but she was also braver than anyone I'd ever known in my entire life. That night, as I lay in my bed, struggling through another relentless bout of nausea and pain, I realized that Sarah had made her choice. She'd chosen me. Not without significant cost. I could see the pain it was causing her, but she'd chosen. She was stepping deliberately into the role of protector now. She was putting herself squarely between her father and her brother's darkness, and I didn't know how to feel about that burden I was placing on her. Grateful, absolutely. Ashamed, completely. My daughter shouldn't have to make that terrible choice, but she had. She had made it, and there was no going back now. Jacob had no idea that his secret had been discovered. He had no idea that the sister he probably didn't think was even paying attention had managed to piece together exactly what he'd been doing all this time. He had no idea that his time was quickly running out. Sarah confronted her brother that same evening without hesitation. She found him in the kitchen, and according to what she told me later that night, she didn't waste any time with pleasantries or careful phrasing. She simply walked up to him and asked the question directly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "What are you putting in Dad's coffee?" Jacob went very still. She said his face went completely pale, the color just drained right out of it. For a long moment he didn't say anything at all. He just stared at her, and she stared back with equal intensity, waiting for an answer she already knew deep down. "Sarah," he started, but she cut him off immediately. "The container in your room, the one hidden under your clothes. I found it. Rat poison, Jacob. You've been poisoning Dad." That's when something shifted dramatically in his expression. The shock faded away, replaced by something much colder, something far more calculating and dangerous. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, studying her face carefully. Then he laughed. Not a real laugh. Something bitter and hollow and deeply disturbing. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice unnaturally calm. "Then explain it to me," Sarah told him, refusing to back down. "Explain to me why you're poisoning our father. Explain to me what you've been doing to him." Jacob pulled out a kitchen chair slowly and sat down deliberately. The casual nature of the gesture, like they were just having a normal, everyday conversation, somehow made it infinitely more terrifying to Sarah. She could feel her heart pounding relentlessly in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears. "I'm in debt," Jacob said simply, as if discussing the weather. "More debt than you can possibly imagine, Sarah. Bad people, really bad people. People who don't accept excuses or payment plans. People who've made it abundantly clear what happens if I don't pay them back soon. So you decided to kill Dad?" "Not kill," Jacob said, and his voice was ice cold. "Manage. Dad's old, Dad's rich, and Dad doesn't have anyone else depending on him anymore. The life insurance policy alone would settle everything. All of it." "Stop," Sarah said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "Just stop talking right now." But Jacob continued, his words coming faster now, pouring out like he'd been waiting for someone to finally understand his perspective. "I've been adding rat poison to his morning coffee for weeks now. Just small amounts. Enough to make him sick, but not enough to kill him immediately. I needed time for the poison to build up in his system. I needed the timeline to be perfect." Sarah told me she felt physically sick listening to him. Her own brother sitting across from her in the kitchen, where we'd all shared countless family breakfasts together, casually discussing how he was methodically destroying our father's life. It was surreal. It was absolutely horrifying beyond words. "I'm going to tell Dad," Sarah said firmly, standing up from the table. "I'm going to tell him everything you've just told me." That's when Jacob's expression changed again completely. The cold calculation was replaced by something much uglier, something dangerous. He stood up too, and he stepped closer to her in a way that made her instinctively want to back away. "If you do that," he said quietly, his voice low and threatening, "you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. I promise you that. You think you can ruin my life and just walk away. You think there are no consequences for betraying your own brother, for destroying everything." Sarah told me her legs were shaking beneath her. She was genuinely afraid of him in that moment. She said she'd never seen him like this, cold, menacing, capable of anything. But she also realized something absolutely crucial. She was more afraid of what would happen to me if she didn't do anything. Fear of Jacob was nothing compared to the terror of watching her father die. "I'm telling him," she said again, and this time her voice didn't waver at all. Jacob's hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. For a moment, she thought he might actually hit her. She said she was preparing herself mentally for that possibility, bracing for impact. But then he stepped back, and when he spoke again, his voice was eerily calm and controlled. "You're making a huge mistake, Sarah. When this goes to the police, when everything falls apart, you're going to lose your brother completely. Our entire family is going to be destroyed forever. And for what? To save a man who's already dying anyway. He's dying because of you." Sarah shot back without hesitation. "And I'm not going to let you finish the job. I'm not going to let you get away with this." She walked out of the kitchen and left him standing there, his fists still clenched, his face twisted with rage. She came straight to my room and found me lying in bed, struggling through another wave of nausea and pain. And she told me everything. She told me about the container hidden in his room, about Jacob's mounting debt and the loan sharks threatening him, about the life insurance policy and his cold, calculated plan. She told me about the rat poison and how he'd been adding it to my morning coffee for weeks. She told me how Jacob had confessed everything when confronted, and she told me about his threat. I listened to it all, my mind struggling desperately to process the betrayal, the premeditation, the sheer evil of it. My son had decided that my life was worth less than his debts. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. I knew what we had to do. "We're going to the police tomorrow morning. First thing. We're going to tell them everything." Sarah nodded, and in that moment I'd never been more proud of her. But before Sarah could tell me everything, something unexpected happened. I needed to get out. That's all I knew at that moment. I needed to leave the house, leave the suffocating atmosphere, leave everything that reminded me of how dangerously close I was to the edge. I'd spent the last few weeks barely leaving my bedroom, completely trapped in a relentless cycle of pain and nausea and despair. Sarah had been wonderfully supportive, but even her presence couldn't chase away the feeling that I was slowly disappearing into nothing. So I called an old friend from my business days, someone I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Michael Thompson. We'd worked together decades ago before I eventually stepped away from the corporate world completely. He'd recently retired himself and had moved to Manhattan, and when I called him that morning, he sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me. "Come into the city," he said immediately. "We'll grab lunch. My treat. You sound like you could use it." Maybe he could hear it in my voice, that desperate, urgent need to feel human again, to pretend for a few hours that I wasn't slowly being destroyed by something nobody could identify or understand, no matter how hard they tried. I told Sarah I was going out. I didn't mention exactly where or why. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, and I could see the conflict written clearly across her face. She clearly wanted to tell me something important, something urgent, but I was already heading for the door with my coat and my keys in hand. I promised her I'd be back by evening. I told her I just needed some fresh air. I remember looking in the mirror before I left the house. I was genuinely shocked by what I saw staring back at me. The man in that reflection was a complete stranger. Gaunt. Hollow. Like someone had hollowed me out from the inside and left just an empty shell behind. My eyes were sunken. My cheeks were hollow. My skin hung loose on my frame. But I was still wearing the watch. Jacob had made that very clear months ago. I was never supposed to take it off. It was a symbol of our bond, he'd said. A promise between father and son. The subway ride into Manhattan seemed to take forever. Every bump, every screech of the brakes, every sudden acceleration sent waves of sharp pain through my body. I gripped the metal pole tightly, trying to steady myself, trying desperately to convince my stomach that it would be okay. Around me, the city flowed in and out, people getting on, people getting off, hundreds of lives happening simultaneously, and I was just a ghost, moving through them all invisibly. I found a seat about halfway through the ride and sat down gratefully. That's when I noticed him. He was an older man, probably around my age, maybe a few years younger. 65, maybe 66 at most. He had genuinely kind eyes and the weathered, capable hands of someone who worked with his hands for a living. He was dressed well, nice button-down shirt, clean slacks, leather shoes that had been recently polished. There was something about him that suggested competence, reliability, genuine skill in his craft. He was looking at my wrist. At first I thought maybe he was just glancing around, casually observing the other passengers the way people do on the subway to pass time. But then I noticed his eyes lingering, really lingering on my wrist. His gaze kept returning repeatedly to the watch. Not in an admiring way exactly. It was more analytical than that, more professional, more calculated. I shifted slightly in my seat, moving my wrist away instinctively. But he'd already seen it. Already seen enough to satisfy his curiosity. "That's a beautiful piece," he said suddenly, his voice warm and genuinely complimentary. Thank you, I replied, genuinely surprised that someone would strike up a conversation with a stranger on the subway. It's vintage, a family heirloom passed down. May I? He asked politely, gesturing toward my wrist with an open hand. I hesitated for just a moment, and then I extended my arm toward him. I'd worn that watch every single day since Jacob gave it to me. It had become so completely a part of me that I'd almost forgotten it was there. Almost forgotten what it truly represented to me. The man took my wrist gently, and I could feel his fingers moving carefully across the watch face, examining it thoroughly and methodically. He turned it slightly, looking at it from different angles, his expression growing more thoughtful with each passing second. "This is an Omega," he said. Finally, his eyes narrowing with professional assessment. "Vintage 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. Beautiful condition overall, but something's definitely off about it." My heart gave a strange little flutter. "Off? What do you mean exactly?" "The casing," he said, his eyes narrowing further. "It's been modified recently. Someone's opened this up and done some deliberate work on the inside. See here." He pointed carefully to a barely perceptible line around the edge of the casing. "That's not original. That's been done very recently by someone with skill." I felt something cold move slowly down my spine. I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. My throat had gone completely dry. "I'm Robert, by the way," the man said, releasing my wrist gently. "I'm a jeweler by trade. Spent 40 years working with watches and fine jewelry, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that whatever's been done to this piece is highly unusual. Very unusual indeed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice coming out hoarse and strained. Robert's expression grew noticeably serious. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear him. "I mean, sir, that this isn't just a watch anymore. Someone's converted this into something else entirely. Something that's been designed to release something slowly. Very slowly. Over an extended period of time." I felt the entire world tilt slightly beneath me. I gripped the pole hard with my other hand to steady myself against the sensation. "Oh, you need to get this to a professional," Robert said firmly. "A forensic expert. This isn't just jewelry anymore. This is evidence of something serious." He handed me his business card and introduced himself properly, but his words were already fading into background noise. I was staring at my wrist, at the watch that I'd been wearing faithfully for months, at the thing my son had given me, with his loving smile and his promises of eternal bonding. I'd just been saved by a stranger on a subway train. I didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change forever. Robert had spent 40 years working with watches and fine jewelry. 40 years of studying craftsmanship, learning how to identify authentic pieces from counterfeits, understanding the intricate mechanics that made a timepiece tick. He could look at a watch and tell you its entire history, its value, its provenance with absolute certainty. He could spot a forgery from across a crowded room instantly. He knew watches the way a doctor knows the human body intimately, completely down to the smallest and most insignificant detail, which meant he knew when something was very, very wrong. He didn't let go of my wrist immediately after his initial observation. Instead, he continued studying the watch with intense concentration, his weathered fingers moving carefully across the surface with the precision of someone accustomed to delicate work. I could see him cataloging information, methodically processing what he was seeing, comparing it against 40 years of accumulated experience and deep knowledge. This is remarkable work," he said finally, his voice quiet and measured. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't amateur hour. This is professional, meticulous, dangerous." "I don't understand what you mean," I said, confusion flooding through me. "That's because you're not supposed to understand," Robert replied carefully. He looked up at me, his kind eyes now serious and deeply concerned. "Mr. Harrison, may I ask you something rather personal? How long have you been wearing this watch consistently?" "About 4 months," I answered. "Ever since Father's Day, actually." Robert nodded slowly, as if something important had just clicked into place for him. "And have you been feeling unwell for approximately the same amount of time?" The question caught me completely off guard. How could this stranger possibly know about my illness? "How did you—" "Lucky guess," Robert said. But it wasn't a lucky guess at all. I could see it clearly written across his face. He already knew something significant that I didn't. Something important. "Can you take this watch off?" he asked, gesturing gently to my wrist. "I'd like to examine it more thoroughly." I unfastened the clasp carefully and handed the watch to him. It felt strange and disorienting releasing it from my wrist after wearing it every single day for months. It felt like removing a piece of myself, like losing a part of my identity. Robert held the watch up to the light streaming through the subway car windows. He examined it from every conceivable angle, turning it slowly and deliberately, his eyes narrowing as he studied something specific I couldn't see or understand. "Feel this," he said, pressing the watch into my palm once more. "Feel the weight carefully." I held it, turning it in my hands, waiting desperately to understand what he meant. "For a watch this particular size," Robert explained patiently, "this weight is completely wrong. It's heavier than it should be by a significant margin. Much heavier. There's something inside this casing that shouldn't be there. Something added deliberately." He took the watch back from me carefully. Then very deliberately, and with obvious expertise, he applied precise pressure to a specific point on the edge of the casing. I heard a soft, almost imperceptible click, and then impossibly, the watch face clicked open like a tiny door revealing its secrets. I stared at it in absolute shock. The watch was open, revealing not the normal mechanical innards of a traditional timepiece, but something else entirely. Something that made my blood run cold immediately. A small glass vial, about the size of my pinky finger, filled with clear, transparent liquid. "Oh my God!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Exactly," Robert said quietly, his expression deeply grave and concerned. "Mr. Harrison, I don't know precisely what's in this vial. I don't know exactly what you've been exposed to over these months. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that this is not a watch. This is a delivery mechanism. A very sophisticated and deliberately engineered one." "What do you mean by delivery mechanism?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, like someone else was speaking through me. Like this was happening to someone else, not to me. "I mean," Robert said slowly and deliberately, "that someone has converted this watch into a container designed to release whatever is inside it very gradually, over an extended period of time. The casing has micro-perforations, tiny holes that allow the contents to escape slowly into the environment, probably through direct skin contact. You've been in close constant contact with this vial for 4 months. Whatever's inside it, you've been absorbing it steadily. Day after day, the subway car seemed to spin around me in nauseating circles. I gripped the metal pole with all my strength, trying desperately to stay upright against the dizziness and horror. "Iko, this is completely wrong," Robert said, and I could hear the urgency in his voice now. It was no longer professional concern. It was alarm. "This is premeditated. This is calculated. This is intentional. Someone gave you this watch knowing exactly what would happen to you, and that's not possible," I said, but even as I said it, I knew it was true. Everything suddenly made horrible, terrible sense. The nausea every morning, the weight loss that wouldn't stop, the hair falling out in clumps, the rashes appearing on my skin, The doctors finding absolutely nothing wrong despite all their tests. It wasn't an illness. It was poisoning. Deliberate, methodical, carefully planned poisoning. My son had given me this watch. Who gave you this watch? Robert asked, though I suspected he already knew the answer. My son. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking it out loud might make it more real. My son gave me this watch. Robert's expression changed immediately. His professional concern shifted into something deeper, something darker. Alarm. He looked at me with a mixture of genuine sympathy and urgent concern. Mr. Harrison, he said carefully and deliberately, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Every word matters. You need to get this watch to the police immediately. You need to tell them everything that's happened, and you need to get medical attention right away. Whatever's in this vial, it's been slowly accumulating in your system. That's why you've been so sick. That's what's been destroying you. I felt the walls closing in on me, suffocating me. My son, the watch, the promise of love, the words about our bond. All of it replaced by something dark and calculated and evil. I can't, I said numbly. You have to, Robert replied firmly. Your life depends on it. And in that moment, sitting on a subway train with a stranger who'd somehow become my savior, I realized that my entire life had just changed fundamentally. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my son, about the watch, and what it represented, all of it was a lie. A carefully constructed deception. All of it had been poison. Robert began to explain what he was seeing, his voice careful and measured, but there was no way to soften what he was about to tell me. This liquid, he said, turning the vial slightly in the light. I've seen something like this before. Not often, but I've encountered it. This appears to be thallium, or a thallium compound of some kind. The words didn't make sense at first. They floated in the air between us like foreign objects, things I couldn't grasp or comprehend. What? I said. Shakitisnio, thallium. Robert repeated, his expression grave. It's a heavy metal, extremely toxic. Someone deliberately filled this vial with it and sealed it inside your watch. Someone did this intentionally, Mr. Harrison. Deliberately. With full knowledge of what would happen. I felt my chest tighten. My hands began to shake visibly. No, I said. No, that's not, my son wouldn't. But even as I said it, everything suddenly became horrifyingly clear. The watch. The Father's Day gift. Jacob pressing me to wear it every single day, checking to make sure I hadn't taken it off. The nausea that started exactly 1 week after I put it on. The weight loss. The hair falling out. The rashes. The doctors finding nothing. And then just when things seemed to be stabilizing slightly, the rat poison in the coffee. The sudden escalation. The additional attack. It was all connected. It was all part of a plan. Jacob had given me the watch, knowing exactly what it contained. Jacob had been poisoning me slowly, methodically, systematically for 4 months. And when the slow poison wasn't working fast enough, he'd added another method. He'd escalated to the coffee. He'd decided to finish what he'd started. My own son. When did he give you this watch? Robert asked, though I could see he already knew. Father's Day. I whispered. He gave it to me on Father's Day and told me never to take it off. He said it was a symbol of our bond. Robert's expression hardened. He lied. Yes, I said, my voice barely audible. He lied. The implications crashed over me like a wave. This wasn't a moment of anger or frustration. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated. This was calculated. This was evil. Jacob had spent months planning this. He'd researched thallium. He'd found someone or figured out how to create this mechanism. He'd given it to me as a gift. He'd watched me wear it every single day, knowing exactly what it was doing to me. "We need to go to the police," Robert said urgently. "Right now." "This is attempted murder, Mr. Harrison. This is serious." I nodded numbly. My hands were still shaking. I felt cold despite being surrounded by people on a warm subway car. I felt like I was going to be sick. "The coffee," I said suddenly. "He's also been putting something in my coffee, every morning for weeks." Robert's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "My daughter told me. She found evidence. She confronted him." "Then this is even more serious," Robert said. "This is a pattern. Multiple attempts. This isn't a one-time thing. This is someone who's committed to seeing you dead." The word dead hung in the air between us. That's what Jacob wanted. That's what all of this had been working toward. My death. "Jacques," I said, and I could hear the pain in my own voice. "Why would he do this?" "I don't know," Robert said. "But right now the why doesn't matter. What matters is stopping him from trying again." I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The subway car swayed, or maybe it was just me. Everything felt unreal, like I was watching this happen to someone else. "Let's go," I said. "We'll go to the police." Robert stood too, holding the watch carefully in a small plastic bag he'd produced from his pocket. A jeweler's habit, I suppose. He tucked it away safely. "Do you have your phone?" he asked. I did. I pulled it out with shaking hands. "Call 911, Robert said. "Tell them you've been poisoned. Tell them you have evidence. Tell them you need to file a report for attempted murder." I looked at the phone in my hand. I looked at Robert. I looked at the other passengers on the subway car, all of them going about their normal lives, unaware that my entire world had just exploded. My son wanted me dead. That was the reality I had to accept now. Jacob Harrison, the man I'd raised, the man I'd provided for the man I'd loved, he wanted me dead badly enough to go through months of careful planning, research, and execution. He wanted my death so much that he was willing to risk getting caught. I thought about Sarah, brave Sarah, discovering the rat poison and confronting him. I thought about all those months of doctors and tests and confusion. I thought about how close I'd come to actually dying without ever knowing why. "Let's go," I said, my voice steady now. Anger had replaced the shock. Determination had replaced the confusion. "Let's go to the police. Let's make sure he never has the chance to hurt anyone else ever again." As we exited the subway car, I made the call. My voice was calm. My hands had stopped shaking. I knew exactly what I needed to do now. And for the first time in months, I felt like I might actually survive. If you're still watching, comment something, let me know you're here with me. Real talk though. If you discovered your son was poisoning you, what would be your first move? Comment your answer, because what happens next is absolutely insane. Quick heads up, the next part has some dramatized moments for storytelling purposes. Some details are fictionalized for privacy. If you'd rather not hear the dramatized version, it's totally fine to exit now. But if you want to know what really went down, buckle up, it's about to get intense. Michael decided to go straight to the police station, without any hesitation. Robert was beside me every step of the way. We exited the subway and hailed a taxi, Robert carefully clutching the plastic bag containing the watch and the vial. Neither of us spoke much during the ride. There wasn't really anything to say. Everything that needed to be said had already been revealed on that subway car. Now it was time for action. Now it was time for the authorities to take over. The precinct was busy when we arrived. Officers moving in and out, phones ringing constantly, the normal chaos of a police station on an average afternoon. I approached the front desk, and the officer there looked up from her computer. "I need to report a crime," I said, and even I could hear how strange my voice sounded. "I've been poisoned. My son tried to poison me." The officer's eyes widened slightly. "Have a seat, sir. Let me get someone for you." Within minutes, I was in an interview room with Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a notebook. She listened carefully as I told her everything. I started from the beginning. The watch on Father's Day. Jacob's insistence that I wear it constantly. The nausea starting exactly 1 week later. The months of doctors and tests finding nothing. The escalation with the rat poison in the coffee. Sarah finding the evidence. Robert discovering the mechanism inside the watch. The thallium. Detective Santos wrote everything down meticulously occasionally, asking clarifying questions. When I mentioned Sarah, she made a note to contact her as well. "Do you have the watch?" she asked. I gestured to Robert, who carefully removed it from the plastic bag and placed it on the table between us. Detective Santos stared at it, then looked at me. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. "I've been a detective for 23 years and I've never seen anything like this." "It's extremely sophisticated," Robert added. "I've been working with watches for 40 years, and I can tell you this required significant skill and knowledge to construct. Someone spent considerable time planning this." "Can you document what you've observed?" Santos asked Robert. "Of course," Robert replied. "I can provide a detailed analysis of the mechanism and the vial. I can testify about it if needed." Santos nodded and made more notes. She called another officer into the room. "I need this watch secured and sent to the lab. Evidence collection. This is potentially a poisoning case." Over the next 2 hours, I underwent a blood test. A nurse came in and drew samples. Detective Santos explained that they would analyze my blood to determine the concentration of thallium in my system and how long it had been accumulating. "Your blood work will help us establish a timeline," she said. "It will show exactly when the poisoning began and how much you've been exposed to. It's crucial evidence." She also took detailed statements from both Robert and me. Robert provided his professional assessment of the watch mechanism in writing. He explained the micro-perforations, the sophisticated design, the deliberate construction of the delivery system. "This wasn't thrown together quickly," Robert told Detective Santos. "This was planned carefully. Someone researched this. Someone learned how to do this. This took time and intention." Santos nodded grimly. "We'll need to bring your son in for questioning." "Do you know where he is right now?" "He should be at home," I said. "Our home." "Oh, we'll handle that," Santos said. "In the meantime, I'm going to be applying for a search warrant for his room and any personal items. We need to look for the source material. We need to find out where he got the thallium. We need to document everything." She paused, looking at me directly. "Mr. Harrison, I have to tell you, if our analysis confirms what you're describing, if we find thallium in your bloodstream at levels consistent with the exposure you've described, this is a serious crime. Attempted murder. Possibly with premeditation. You're going to be an important witness in this case." "I understand," I said. "Hakiwan, we're also going to need to interview your daughter," Santos continued. "The one who discovered the rat poison, Sarah." "Her name is Sarah," I said. "She was very brave. She confronted Jacob about it. She chose me over her brother." Santos made a note. "We'll need to talk to her as well. She's a witness to the second attempt." The process took hours. Questions, answers, clarifications, documentation. By the time we finished, the sun was beginning to set outside the police station windows. Detective Santos walked me and Robert to the door. "We're taking this very seriously, Mr. Harrison," she said. "We'll be bringing your son in for questioning tomorrow morning. We're getting the search warrant tonight, and we'll have initial lab results within 72 hours. "What happens in the meantime?" I asked. In the meantime, you need to take care of yourself. Get medical attention. See a doctor who specializes in heavy metal poisoning. Keep yourself safe, and stay available to us. We may need you for testimony." As Robert and I walked out of the police station into the evening air, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there. The betrayal was still there. The shock was still there. But underneath all of it, there was something else now. Hope. Justice was coming. The system was moving. Detective Santos and her team were going to investigate. They were going to find the evidence. They were going to hold Jacob accountable. Jacob had no idea what was happening. He had no idea that his sister had found him out. He had no idea that a stranger on a subway had discovered his carefully constructed trap. He had no idea that his father had just walked into a police station and provided every detail of his crimes. He had no idea that his time was running out. Very soon the police would arrive at his door. Very soon he would be arrested and questioned and confronted with evidence he couldn't deny. Very soon Jacob would face the consequences of what he'd done, and I would be there to make sure of it. When Jacob discovered that Michael knew everything, he became unhinged. Detective Santos had warned me before I left the police station. "We're going to move quickly on this, Mr. Harrison. We have the evidence. We have your testimony. We have the lab confirmation starting to come in. But I need to ask you something important. Do you want to call your son? Do you want to tell him what you've done?" I thought about it for only a moment. "Yes," I said. "I want him to know that I know." Santos nodded. "That's your choice. Just be aware that this might prompt him to do something unpredictable. Are you prepared for that?" "I need to do this," I said. "I made the call from my apartment that evening. Sarah was there with me, and so was Robert. They both urged me to be careful to keep the call brief, to say nothing that might escalate the situation further. But I needed Jacob to know. I needed him to understand that his careful plan had completely unraveled. "Jacob," I said when he answered. "It's Dad." "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice careful and controlled. Too controlled, like he was already preparing a story, an explanation. "I know everything, Jacob. I know about the watch. I know about the thallium. I know about the rat poison. I know about all of it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about." He started, but his voice had changed. There was a tremor in it now. "Fear. The police know too," I continued. "I've given them everything. The watch, evidence, your confession to Sarah, all of it." I heard him breathe sharply. Then his voice changed completely. The careful control evaporated. What replaced it was something raw and desperate and furious. "You had no right," he said, his voice rising. "You had no right to do this. After everything I've been through, after everything I owe. You were supposed to—" "I was supposed to die," I said quietly. "That was your plan." "Yes," he shouted. "Yes, that was the plan. You're old. You're rich. You don't need the money like I do. You have no idea what it's like owing people like I owe them. People who hurt you if you don't pay. You were just going to—" He stopped himself, but it was too late. He'd already admitted everything. Sarah grabbed my hand, her eyes wide. "The police are coming for you, Jacob," I said. "Turn yourself in. Make this easier on yourself." "No," he said, and I could hear something breaking in his voice. Panic, rage, desperation all mixed together. "No, this isn't over. You think you've won, but you haven't. This isn't over." He hung up. Sarah's face went pale. "Dad, what did he mean? What does he mean it's not over?" I didn't have to wait long to find out. 20 minutes later, the apartment building's security system alarmed. Someone was forcing their way in through the back entrance. Sarah screamed, and I immediately called 911. "He's here," I told the dispatcher. "My son, Jacob Harrison. He's here." I could hear footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, furious footsteps. getting closer. Stay behind me, I told Sarah, pulling her toward the bedroom. The apartment door exploded open. Jacob stood there wild-eyed and manic. His hair was disheveled. His clothes were torn. He looked nothing like the son I'd known. He looked like someone completely unraveled. You ruined everything, he said, his voice hoarse. Everything. Do you understand what you've done? I've protected myself, I said quietly. I've done what I should have done months ago. You've destroyed me, Jacob said, and I could see his hands shaking. One of his hands was clenched into a fist. The other was holding something. I couldn't see it clearly, but my stomach dropped. He took a step toward me. That's when the apartment door burst open again. Police officers flooded in their weapons, drawn their voices, commanding, "Police freeze! Get on the ground now!" Jacob spun around, and for a moment I thought he might try to run. Instead, he lunged toward me. One of the officers moved faster. She tackled Jacob to the ground with practiced efficiency, his body slamming against the floor with a force that drove all the air from his lungs. "Don't move," the officer commanded. "Don't even breathe hard." Jacob was screaming incoherently, struggling against the officer's grip. They had him restrained in seconds, handcuffs, the whole procedure. Detective Santos emerged from the hallway, her expression grim. "Are you all right?" she asked me. I nodded numbly. "We've been monitoring your son since you called," Santos said. "We knew what he was likely to do. We were positioned outside waiting. He made a serious mistake coming here." "What's he holding?" I asked, pointing to the object that had fallen from his hand during the struggle. One of the officers picked it up carefully. It was a knife, a large kitchen knife with a blade at least 6 inches long. "He was going to try to finish what he started," Santos said quietly. "With this." Jacob was being led out of my apartment now, still screaming, still struggling, completely lost to rage and desperation. The police officers moved him efficiently toward the stairs. As he was being led past me, he turned his head and looked at me with an expression of pure hatred. "I hope you die," he snarled. "I hope you suffer for the rest of your life. I hope you regret this every single day." "I regret that I raised you," I said quietly. "But I don't regret saving myself." Sarah was crying beside me, her entire body shaking. Robert put his arm around her shoulders, offering what comfort he could. Detective Santos turned to me. "Your son is now under arrest for attempted murder, attempted homicide, and assault with a deadly weapon. You did the right thing, Mr. Harrison. You protected yourself and your daughter. And now you've protected everyone else from him as well." "Will he go to prison?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "Almost certainly," Santos said. "What he's done, the premeditation, the multiple attempts, yes. He's going to prison for a long time." As the police officers led Jacob away, I felt something release inside me. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant danger, it was finally over. Jacob was in custody. He couldn't hurt me anymore. He couldn't hurt anyone. Justice wasn't just coming anymore. Justice had finally arrived. Justice had finally been served. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Detective Santos presented the watch, the vial of thallium, and the lab results showing poison in my bloodstream. Robert testified about the sophisticated mechanism inside the watch, deliberate, engineered, intentional. The forensic pathologist explained how thallium accumulates over months, causing exactly the symptoms I'd experienced. Jacob's defense crumbled quickly. His own search history revealed he'd researched thallium and poison delivery mechanisms. Text messages showed him calculating life insurance payouts. By the 2nd week, his lawyer advised a plea deal. Jacob accepted it, pleading guilty to attempted murder. The judge was unmoved. "You poisoned your own father deliberately and with premeditation," she said coldly. You would have succeeded if not for a stranger and Detective Santos's quick action. This court sentences you to 25 years in prison without parole for the first 10 years. Jacob was led away in handcuffs, his future now defined by prison walls. Sarah wept when the verdict was read, tears of relief, not sadness. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "You were brave," I replied. "You chose what was right." My recovery was gradual. The effects of 4 months of thallium poisoning don't disappear overnight. My hair took months to grow back. My appetite returned slowly. But day by day I felt myself returning. The doctors explained that the human body is remarkably resilient. Given time, it can recover from most poisoning. "You're lucky," one told me. "Another few months and the damage might have been irreversible." Lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. Robert and I became close friends. We'd meet for coffee every few weeks and talk about what happened. He never made a big deal about saving my life, but I knew the truth. Without him, I would be dead. "It was just chance," he said once. "I just happened to be on that subway at that exact moment." "No," I told him. "It was more than luck. It was fate." Sarah and I rebuilt our relationship. We had dinner together every Sunday, talking about her life, my recovery moving forward. One evening, 6 months after Jacob's sentencing, Sarah asked, "Do you forgive him?" "And I forgive him." I said, not because what he did was forgivable, but because holding on to anger only poisons me further. He wanted to destroy me. I won't give him that power from prison. As months became years, I settled into a new normal. I didn't return to work. Instead, I focused on recovery and sharing my story. I wrote about recognizing the signs of poisoning. I spoke to groups about trusting instincts and listening to people who notice things we miss. Because that's the real lesson: how easily we ignore small signs. How often we dismiss our instincts because we don't want to believe the worst of people. How important it is to pay attention. I kept the watch in a safe deposit box. I couldn't throw it away. It was evidence, but more importantly, a reminder. A reminder of how close I came to death. A reminder of how lucky I was. A reminder of how a complete stranger changed my life. Robert once said that if he hadn't been observant, if he hadn't spent 40 years learning to see things others missed, I would be dead. He's right. Life is fragile. Trust is precious. And sometimes the people we love most are capable of terrible things. But sometimes a stranger on a train can save your life. Sometimes justice does prevail. Sometimes recovery is possible. And sometimes you're given a second chance. If Robert hadn't been on that subway at that exact moment, if he hadn't looked at my watch, if he hadn't recognized something was wrong, I wouldn't be here now. I'm grateful for that chance. I'm grateful to be alive. Looking back at my story now, I can see every mistake I made. I trusted too easily. I ignored the warnings. I dismissed my own instincts about my son because I didn't want to believe the worst of him, and nearly paid with my life. So let me be clear, don't do what I did. Don't ignore the small signs. Don't dismiss the feeling that something isn't right just because you don't want to face the truth. Don't wait for proof when your gut is screaming at you that something is wrong. Trust your instincts. Please. I'm begging you. Listen to the people around you who notice things you don't. Sarah saved my life because she was paying attention. Robert saved my life because he was observant. Don't be like me, arrogant enough to think you have all the answers. I learned that God works through people. He placed Sarah in my life to watch over me. He placed Robert on that subway at exactly the right moment. He guided Detective Santos to move quickly and thoroughly. God doesn't always save us the way we expect, but He does save us if we're willing to see His hand at work. I also learned that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge. I forgave Sarah. I forgave myself for my blindness, and that forgiveness freed me. It allowed me to heal. God teaches us to forgive not because what happened was okay, but because holding on to bitterness poisons us far more than any metal ever could. Most importantly, I learned that God gives us second chances. He gave me one. He gave me my life back. And He's given me the chance to share this story so that maybe, just maybe, someone listening will avoid my mistake. Don't wait until it's too late. Pay attention. Trust your instincts. And remember, God is always watching over you, even when you can't see it. If my story resonated with you, please comment below. Share your own stories of instinct saving you. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories of survival and redemption. Let's build a community of people who listen to that small voice inside. Because sometimes that voice is God speaking, and sometimes it saves your life.